The Plantagenets ruled England for more than 300 years. Its first king was Henry II, who ruled from 1154 to 1189. The name Plantagenet comes from a flower that Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, used to wear on his hat. Henry's succession to the throne had been riddled by complications. 20 years before Henry became king, it was his mother, the Empress Matilda, who was heir to the throne of England. Matilda had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. On Henry's death, she returned to England and the court of her father, Henry I, but she retained the title of Empress throughout her life. Her second marriage was to Geoffrey of Anjou. The match pleased neither of them, but they got on with things and produced children, including the future Henry II. Matilda was one of two legitimate children of Henry I and his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, who died in 1118. The other child was a boy named William. As well as these two children, Henry I is believed to have sired as many as 24 illegitimate children with various mistresses. Henry probably should have spent more time focusing on producing further legitimate children, as in 1120 disaster struck for his son and heir, William. Henry I and the royal court had been on the continent, but were preparing to return to England in the winter of 1120. Henry was to sail on one ship, whilst his heir, William, and other young members of the nobility were to sail on another that had been borrowed for the occasion. This was called the White Ship. The White Ship soon became rowdy with youthful exuberance, as those on board began to thoroughly enjoy themselves as they threw a massive party. Meanwhile, the more sombre ship, carrying the king, had already set off, leaving the White Ship lagging behind. The now very drunk crew decided that they were going to remedy that fact by sailing at such a pace where they could not only catch up with the king, but also overtake him. As you can well imagine, this was an idea fraught with danger. Some on board recognised the danger before it was too late. One man by the name of Stephen of Blois claimed to have a stomach upset and disembarked, and it was a sensible decision that saved Stephen's life. It would also be a fateful one in English history, as 15 years later, Stephen claimed the throne ahead of the Empress Matilda. The White Ship, with its steaming drunk crew and passengers, set sail, but immediately ran into grave problems. Almost before they had even left the harbour, the White Ship sailed straight into a rock and began to sink into the freezing water. Raucous cheers and laughter now turned into screams of terror and horror. William, being the king's heir, was bundled hastily into a lifeboat and would have survived the disaster had he not acted so bravely. In the midst of all the chaos, he heard the cries of his half-sister, another Matilda, not to be confused with the Empress Matilda. The 17-year-old prince ordered the boat to be turned about in order to save the life of this Matilda, but the boat was swamped as others, desperate to save themselves, tried to clamber into the lifeboat. It capsized, and into the water went William. With his death, the course of English history changed forever. The king and his party returned home safely. However, news soon filtered through about the disaster that had befallen the king in Barfleur harbour, just off the coast of Normandy. The magnitude of the event was not lost on anybody, and the nobles were understandably frightened of telling the king the tragic news. In fact, so afraid were they of informing the king that grown men shirked their responsibility and instead got a terrified young boy to do the dirty work. When Henry had finally been told, he was devastated. Firstly, on a personal front, he had lost 3 children in the tragedy: William and 2 illegitimate children, Matilda and another son called Richard. This was a sorry tale for the king indeed, but it was also a disaster for the king on a dynastic front as well. With his heir dead, Henry had no obvious successor. He had one surviving daughter and a score of illegitimate children. England at this time expected a king who'd be able to ride into battle, if needed, and protect the country from domestic and foreign enemies. Simply because she was a woman, Matilda would have been considered by many to be an inappropriate candidate for the throne. As time would tell, Henry would not necessarily share that line of thinking. However, he still recognised it would be preferable for him to produce another male heir or two to secure the crown that had been won by his father, William the Conqueror, and produce a dynasty that would last generations and avoid civil war on Henry's death, which would tarnish his legacy. Bearing all that in mind, Henry, a widower, did in fact marry again. His second wife was a young woman by the name of Adeliza of Louvain. Try as they might, though, the marriage failed to produce any children. This is almost certainly Henry's own fault. Spending too much time with mistresses in his younger years had come back to haunt him. In the Middle Ages, kings didn't just need one son, ideally, they produced several in the eventuality of premature death. This was a common sense route to take, as infant mortality was high. Henry had been unlucky in one sense that William had survived infancy and was becoming a young man when he died, but even then there was no guarantee William would outlive his father had the accident not happened. Henry should have produced spares. This is probably the biggest flaw of an otherwise competent and wise king. Another reason to suspect that the reason for the barren marriage was Henry's fault was that, after his death in 1135, Adeliza married again. This time she produced 7 children. There was evidently nothing physically wrong with her. Henry's overindulgence had come back to bite him. Once it occurred to the old king that no more sons were forthcoming, he had to weigh up his options. He considered for a time making one of his illegitimate sons his heir, but in the end he settled on his daughter Matilda. One thing that may have swayed Henry in his decision making was that Matilda already had experience in administration. During her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, she had played a key role in Henry's governance, handling petitions and grants. What's more, after her return to England on Henry's death in 1125, she married again, albeit reluctantly, in 1128 to Geoffrey of Anjou, and with him she produced 3 sons, including the future Henry II in 1133. The old king would have been delighted at the birth of his grandson, and he showed it as well. Chroniclers tell how the king took great pleasure in meeting the baby Henry, and he proved to be a doting grandfather. In this little boy, the old king may have recognised a potential stabilising force in English politics, as he knew Matilda's succession would certainly not go uncontested. Apart from his fondness for women, another of Henry's vices was his love of lampreys, a type of eel. His doctors had warned him that eating too many could prove dangerous, and so it proved. In 1135, after another overindulgence, Henry became gravely ill. The time had come to ensure a smooth succession to the throne for his daughter. Henry gathered his nobles around his deathbed to ensure that they swore loyalty to Matilda, but deep down, Henry would have known this meant very little. His distrust of them was evident. This was the third time the nobility had been forced to swear loyalty to Matilda, and just 3 weeks after the old king had died, England had a new monarch, and it wasn't the Empress Matilda. Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England just a few days before Christmas 1135. Almost immediately, Stephen faced challenges in his kingdom. The King of Scotland, David I, invaded and captured Newcastle and Carlisle. Eager to look proactive, Stephen marched north to deal with the invasion, but the campaign was not overly successful and did little to improve Stephen's public image. Although he regained control of Newcastle, Stephen settled for a rather pathetic agreement, which meant David retained Carlisle. In 1137, Stephen reached an agreement with Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, which meant Stephen retained control of Normandy. Stephen largely had Henry I to thank for that. He had inherited a kingdom in a healthy financial state and plenty of men at his disposal, so this left him in a rather strong position when it came to negotiations with Geoffrey. However, the situation would change in the years to come. In 1138, the folly of Stephen's weak capitulation to David I of Scotland was fully exposed as David once again invaded the north. There are graphic descriptions of atrocities carried out during this latest invasion. Some are almost certainly exaggerations, but all the same, Stephen, because of the weak agreement he had agreed to in early 1136, had left the north of his kingdom extremely vulnerable to further attacks. In response to David's provocation, Stephen led an expedition into the south of Scotland, burning and laying waste to enemy territory. He then returned southwards after getting word of trouble in the West Country, but whilst he was gone, David once again invaded, but this time he was defeated by Stephen's northern nobility at the Battle of the Standard. It's somewhat ironic that Stephen's biggest success so far was a victory in battle whilst he was hundreds of miles away. All the same, it proved that Stephen did have significant support on his side. This was key for a usurper. In 1139, Stephen's rival for the throne, Matilda, finally arrived in England. Again, Stephen attempted to be proactive and besieged Matilda at Arundel. Again, he made a poor and weak decision. Rather than continuing the siege and keeping Matilda on the back foot, he let her slip away as she made her way to Bristol, which was the power base of her key ally, her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester. Stephen now had a serious problem on his hands. In 1140, the king marched northwards to Lincoln, which had fallen into the hands of his enemies. Stephen settled in for what was a potentially long siege. The man who had captured Lincoln was Ranulph, Earl of Chester, who also happened to be Robert of Gloucester's son-in-law. Robert too journeyed to Lincoln in a bid to relieve the siege, and here the forces loyal to Matilda and the king's army met in battle in 1141. When battle became inevitable, Stephen had one of his nobles, called Baldwin, give a rousing speech to his soldiers. Stephen himself didn't give the speech due to his weak speaking voice. The king spent the morning before the battle taking mass and asking for divine assistance against his enemies. No help was forthcoming. To credit Stephen, he did not shy away from the battle, and he threw himself into the midst of the throng and fought bravely. His acts, so far as king, had been largely uninspiring, but he would have impressed his men by his conduct at Lincoln. However, he and his army were soon overwhelmed, and Stephen was captured. The path to claim the throne that should have been rightfully hers in 1135 finally appeared to be clear for the Empress Matilda. With the king now taken into custody at Bristol, Matilda made preparations to journey to London, where she'd have herself crowned. Unfortunately, it didn't prove as straightforward as that for her, as the people of London despised her. Matilda was accused of being pompous and insufferably arrogant. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that the Empress was a little on the arrogant side. She had, after all, retained her imperial title, which may be a sign of a slightly inflated ego, but Matilda's personality would have been criticised regardless of what traits she had. There would have been considerable pushback to the idea of a female ruler, and indeed Matilda's reliance on Robert of Gloucester may have given that some credibility. He was the one that was truly leading the fight against Stephen. However, this does not get away from the fact that Matilda was the rightful heir to Henry I, and there's a good chance, had she succeeded, the civil war may have been avoided, or, at the very least, may not have dragged on as long as it did. Either way, Matilda was rejected by the people of London and forced to flee. Then even worse was to follow for her. Robert of Gloucester was captured by forces loyal to Stephen. This was a calamity, and Matilda knew it. In the end, if Matilda harboured any realistic hopes of gaining the crown, then she needed Robert, and his release was agreed in exchange for the release of King Stephen. This may have been a relief to Stephen, but his reign was hardly in a good state. He had been defeated in battle, and he had lost Normandy in 1144 to Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou. The rest of Stephen's reign was dominated by him struggling to stamp his authority on his kingdom, as he lost control of places like Worcester. This was a destructive time in English history, known as the Anarchy, and not much good can be said of it. One description of the period goes, this was a time when Christ and his angels slept. By the early 1150s, Matilda's eldest son, Henry, was coming of age, and, in his mother's name, he launched his own rather hopeful and over-ambitious expedition to usurp Stephen. It was unsuccessful, but by 1153, Stephen, having clung on to power for 18 dismal years, had finally been worn down. Shortly before, another destructive battle was fought, and agreement was reached that made Henry Stephen's heir. Matilda had now given up hope of her ever wearing the crown, but she at least would see her energetic and impressive young son become the first Plantagenet king. The agreement, known as the Treaty of Wallingford, allowed Stephen to remain king until his death, which would come the following year. It also disinherited Stephen's son, who wasn't impressed and died not long after. History in this period could have been completely different. What if William, heir of Henry I and the Empress Matilda's brother, had stayed in the lifeboat? What if Henry I had managed to produce another male heir? What if the nobles and England as a country accepted Matilda as their monarch? What type of ruler would she have been? Alas, we do not know. What we do know is the next 331 years of Plantagenet rule that followed the succession of Henry II in 1154 would be a remarkable period in history.